What is up, ladies and gents? This is George Bean, and I have just gotten back from seeing Avengers Endgame in the cinema, and this is my quickie review for the movie. And fair warning, this is going to be some mild spoilers contained within this video, so if you haven't seen the movie yet, I definitely recommend that you turn off this video, go and see Avengers Endgame. I assure you that you will not be disappointed by it. It is that good. As it should be duly noted, Avengers Endgame is the 22nd installment in the MCU franchise. It is also the second half in an epic two-parter that had begun with Avengers Endgame in 2018, and it has also been marketed as being the sort of final chapter to the so-called Infinity Saga concerning the overarching antagonist Thanos and the Infinity Stones, and certain members in the original Avengers roster, specifically Iron Man and Captain America. The plot, set immediately after the events of Avengers Civil War, Infinity War, the film follows the surviving Avengers, who now have to deal with the fallout of Thanos' destructive actions that have resulted in 50% of all life in the known universe to be wiped out. But with the sudden help of Captain Marvel and Ant-Man, the Avengers set out on a final mission to do whatever it takes to undo Thanos' destruction and save the universe once and for all. Of course, I had done an anticipations and expectations video concerning this film just almost a week before its theatrical release. And just as I had expected it would, Endgame had released to overwhelmingly positive receptions from critics, audiences, and fans alike. But to my own huge surprise, at the box office, the film had grossed over $1.3 billion worldwide on its opening weekend alone. That is a huge milestone in the history of box office. Once again, Marvel Studios did the impossible. And while it was a huge surprise to me, it really shouldn't have been to me, given how the hype for this film was at a fever pitch, so of course audiences would go and see it in droves. And knowing that this film's production was said to have been $356 million, the studio don't really have to worry about whether or not this film would recoup its costs. They can now look forward to going home with huge paychecks in their pockets and wallets. And people are now currently discussing the possibility of Endgame that might have a chance of possibly overtaking Avatar's place as the highest grossing film of all time. Judging by how I'm seeing it, I honestly believe that Endgame might have such a chance. I could think of three reasons for it. The first being how great the movie had turned out to be. After spending 11 years watching 22 films in the franchise, the hype for Endgame was of course going to be at fever pitch. No matter how flawed it really was, the screenplay had managed the ultimate task of living up to the build-up that had been leading into it, further helped by the massive amount of care that had been handled in crafting this universe when progressing forward in the past 11 years of its running. The second is how massive its opening weekend box office had turned out. It decimated box office records and grossed over $1.3 billion on its first weekend alone, a feat which had not been accomplished before. This was strongly helped by the massive audience interest and hype in it. And I also believe that word of mouth had helped give it that further push. Think of it. The first group of people who go to see it and are blown away by it, they are going to go tell their friends and whoever else about how good Endgame was, and that they recommend to go see it too. And it's also very likely that the first group will go see it again. So this movie's chances in eclipsing Avatar could be helped by strong word of mouth, its massive opening weekend box office, and its overwhelmingly positive receptions. And the third is the popularity surrounding the film itself and the franchise on a whole. At the time of its release, Avatar was also a big event film, mainly for its innovative 3D effects, and also the fact that it was James Cameron's first directorial job in 12 years since Titanic in 1997. But for the MCU, it has been going on for like 11 years, and so Endgame was destined to be very huge. And I do have to say, it was spectacular. It had certainly lived up to the hype for me, and yet had also surprised me as well. It had done exactly what it had promised it would do, and yet also still have a few surprises up its sleeve. Yes, this movie did have very huge surprises for us. Whether any of us will accept them or not depends on how we see them. As expected, the film begins immediately after the events of Infinity War, specifically 3 weeks after Thanos' decimation. The Avengers manage to reunite on Earth, but they are so depressed and guilt-ridden by what has happened, and the fact that they had actually lost this time. It is very hard for them. Most of the Avengers are intent on searching for Thanos to confront them and hopefully undo the damage he had caused. But Tony Stark has pretty much given up now, having lost Peter Parker in the fight, and has now decided to retire to a normal life with Pepper Potts. Much like what the ads showed us, the Avengers, with help from Captain Marvel, once again played by Brie Larson, go on the Guardians ship Milano ship captained by Rocket and travel to a distant planet referred to as the Garden to confront Thanos there and retrieve the stones from him. I don't know if it was just me, but the shots of the garden and how Thanos is reintroduced in the film kind of reminds me of Colonel Kurtz in Apocalypse Now. But given how Brolin had admitted that he had based his performance on Kurtz, it wouldn't surprise me if the establishing shots of him were homaging the Apocalypse Now. Of course, the Avengers find him there and confront him in his hut, finding him in very bad shape. The side of his flesh badly burnt from the snap, the gauntlet itself seemingly melted onto his hand. He looks exhausted. The best bit was when Thor bursts in and quickly chops Thanos' hand off, making sure he doesn't use the gauntlet again. But much to their shock and horror, Thanos reveals to them that he had destroyed the stones to prevent any further use. In a fit of rage, Thor ends up decapitating Thanos and leaves the hut in despair. The scene is done very well. There was an atmosphere of shock and horror and disbelief that they had actually failed, and there's nothing they can do to fix that. And of course they do avenge the fallen by killing Thanos, but it doesn't feel completely satisfying to the team. It is not enough. They feel they have failed in living up to their team name. The film then cuts to 5 years later in the year 2023, and the world is still reeling from losing loved ones on the decimation day. And there is even a sort of program for people who feel unable to move on from that day. Most of the Avengers, mainly Rogers, Romanoff, Rhodey, Rocket, and Nebula, are working out in the world to at least have some sense of momentum. Meanwhile, Stark has successfully retired to a normal family life with now wife Pepper Potts, and even has a daughter named Morgan. And Thor has pretty much let himself go, feeling very guilt-ridden for his failure, and has now drowned himself in alcohol. In this film, he has a beer belly. He sort of becomes like the dude in The Big Lebowski. Hell, I don't even have to make that comparison. Tony did that for me. But overall, despite their trying to move on, the team obviously still can't. They feel very responsible for what had happened and are guilt-ridden for their failures in stopping Thanos. But then out of the blue, Ant-Man, or Scott Lang, once again played by Paul Rudd, shows up and, after having been presumed dead, and reveals to the team that he had been trapped in the quantum realm, but that he had only been there for 5 hours. This gives them the idea that time can be distorted, essentially time travel, and thus he proposes a plan to travel back in time to certain points in the past to acquire the Infinity Stones and hopefully undo Thanos' destruction, or as he would put it, a time heist to be exact. The time travel plot was something I did not expect this film to go into. It's amazing to think that Marvel has actually managed to keep that a secret for so long, at least like a year or two since it was first written in the script and filmed during production. I was really surprised that this film was going to feature time travel as a plot device. But once I had heard of the time heist plan, it had obviously reminded very much of the plot to Back to the Future Part 2, in which it also featured a similar premise of the heroes time traveling to the past to acquire something from the villain which could decide the fate of the future. I mean, again, even Tony had pointed out that fact too, so I wasn't the only one who thought of that. A nice little Back to the Future name drop there. So yes, this movie does very much have a three-act structure to it. The first act is about the Avengers having to deal with their failures in stopping Thanos. The second act is about them performing a time heist adventure to acquire the stones. And the third act is the final battle between all of the Avengers and Thanos and his army. But to mention as a heads up, this Thanos they fight in the third act is actually from the past, specifically 2014, around the time of Guardians of the Galaxy. So this is his younger self whom they fight in the climax, as he ends up figuring out what he will do and what will happen, and so he sets out to stop the Avengers from undoing what he will do in the future. It's actually pretty cool. We have two Thanos, the much older one whom we've been following since Avengers 1, up until he is killed in this film's first act, and the much younger one who accepts his future destiny and is more stronger than evil, sort of similar to what happens with both Doc Brown and Biff Tannen in the Back to the Future movies. They're told that what they will do in the future, and so they accept their fates and do what they can to ensure that. Of course, we all know that there will be more MCU films after this, but as it stands, as the epic conclusion to the so-called Infinity Saga, Avengers Endgame does that with flying colors. It pitch perfectly concludes any and all characters and plot threads introduced in the first three phases, or the aforementioned Infinity Saga, which centers on Thanos and the Infinity Stones. Yes, it is not pitch perfect and there are flaws within it, but it was mainly intended to feel a sense of conclusion and catharsis for the fans who have followed this universe since its inception. And something I feel I need to bring up too is how this film was actually foreshadowed in Age of Ultron. It's when Scarlet Witch hexes Tony and causes him to hallucinate his worst fear, that being him being unable to protect the Earth nor the Avengers from a second alien invasion, one that would likely be too much for them to overcome and defeat. This vision of him seeing the Avengers dead on the ground while hordes of Chitauri aliens enter a much larger portal to Earth invade it. In said vision, we saw little tidbits that actually foreshadow what ends up happening in Endgame, such as Cap's broken shield, their final battle being against an overwhelming alien invasion, which includes the Chitauri army. And as it should be noted, this film does pay off what had been set up in Infinity War, that being how Doctor Strange said that he went forward in time to see the possible outcomes in their battle against Thanos. Strange says he saw over 14 million outcomes, and in only one do they actually win. And after giving the Time Stone up to Thanos, but before being dusted away, he claims to Tony that they were in the end game now, and that there was no other way, meaning that everything that had happened then and would happen now in this film was the only way for them to win. So yeah, this movie does keep that in mind and actually pays off. In the climax, when Tony reunites with Strange, he asks him if what is currently happening is the one way he had talked about. Strange does pretty much confirm that fact, but doesn't reveal too much. And when the battle finally ends and the Avengers finally win, we pretty much see for ourselves that what then happens here was that one way. One bit I do love in the final battle was when Thanos is confronted by the returning Scarlet Witch. She's obviously pissed at him, and so she used her powers entirely to kick his ass, and was damn near close to killing him until he had to call for help. That was embarrassing for Thanos to call for help there, especially when getting his ass beaten by her. It was really awesome to watch, getting to see that Wanda actually used the whole of her powers and getting Thanos' ass handed to him on a plate was very satisfying and awesome to watch. That was really badass of Wanda to do that. I understand that they're making a TV series centered on Wanda and Vision on the Disney Plus streaming service, but honestly, if you had to ask me, I'd say that Wanda and Vision actually deserve to have their own solo movie first. Let them have a movie to shine in, and maybe use the movie to bridge into the show. That'd be cool to watch. I would happily take a Scarlet Witch movie over another Captain Marvel movie any day. Now, I won't outright spoil what happens in the end, but what I can say is that it will leave you in tears. How it handles the characters' fates and concludes all plot threads, even with all the flaws it has. I believe it was the best way to do it in a way that would be satisfying to the franchise and the fan base. It had really left me teary-eyed throughout the ending. I am so happy to have gotten to see this in the cinema. There couldn't have been any other way I could have seen this, such as on DVD. I may actually go and see this again, just so I could watch it again. So yes, this movie is not pitch perfect, and I'm sure that we will eventually notice its flaws once the popularity has died down. But then again, no other movie is ever pitch perfect. Even the most perfect movies have flaws within them. So as it is, Endgame is perfectly perfect as well. Maybe not quite as perfect or straightforward as, say, Infinity War, but it does its job in surfacing the story, the characters, and especially the fans. It's certainly a lot better than, say, Justice League, or even one of the Michael Bay Transformers sequels. For now, you just gotta enjoy it as it is, and not think too hard about the flaws in it. But also, for any of y'all who might have been put off by Captain Marvel's solo movie, and might have been worried about her possibly taking the spotlight away from the team in this film, do not worry. I promise you that she is barely even in this film at all. She only appears in the first act and the third act. That's it. This movie focuses primarily on the Avengers. This is their movie. Not hers. Theirs. And finally, one other thing is that after this film, things are going to be very different in the MCU from here on out. I predict that Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 is going to be very different from its first two films, mainly in its team roster, if you know what I mean. And for Black Panther 2, I suspect that we'll probably explore the consequences of T'Challa opening Wakanda to the world and how that had ended up leaving it open for an invasion in Infinity War. So overall, I feel I'm willing to give Avengers Endgame a rating of 9.5 stars out of 10 for now. Because as it is now, it was an amazing, epic conclusion to the 22-film Infinity Saga in the MCU, and it pitch perfectly concludes Iron Man and Captain America's story arcs in a very worthy note. And given how this film is intended to be the titular team's swan song, it does what it can to remain focused on them and their chemistry together as they go through what is to be their one last adventure. The overall film is a masterpiece to watch in the cinema, and again, the fact that it had actually attempted to conclude certain story arcs will most likely help it stay in audience mindset for a long time. So as a fellow movie buff, I definitely recommend that you go see Avengers Endgame in the cinema. You have to see this one. You have to see this one on the huge cinema screen to be wowed by it. And as my friendly advice, when you go into the theater to go see it, make sure to use the bathroom before it starts. Grab yourself some food, do not get soda. Only get something like water or iced tea. Sit back and relax in your seat, and you will have the night of your life. This was definitely worth the 11 years of time and effort spent on experiencing this franchise. So thank you for watching, ladies and gents. Given how I now have done this review for Avengers Endgame, I also plan to do a review for Avengers Infinity War very soon, so expect that review to be out sometime very soon. So thanks for watching, and until then, I will see you all next time. Peace!